several items on today's agenda. This one is very much a moving target. And even when we get to the end and talk about action items, that will be reflected in how we're asking to proceed on some things. We have in the submittal some highlights about the charter school results, some of which you've already seen by email or the committee kind of poured through them at its meeting 2 weeks ago. And we'll recap some of that today. Since the information came out and the reports came out in the schools, we've been scrambling to work through some of the data questions, working closely with the department, trying to get to resolution of some questions and get more information to the schools. Doug especially has just been changes for weeks on this, working heroically, and we've had a lot of great help from the department. I want to acknowledge the presence of Assistant Superintendent Steve Schatz and Deputy Mizoy's Chief of Staff Lindsay Pincus, who are here not to present, but they're available to answer questions as we walk through this topic. I will be letting Doug kind of walk you through the results of some of the data. I did want to share some very positive news that just came this morning, thanks to Assistant Superintendent Schatz and Lindsay Pincus, that as a result of some of the questions that the department and the commission staff have been working through, there are going to be some adjustments to the StriveHI results. They're still in the process of letting the schools know, so the information is embargoed while they do that, and they're going to publicly release the information tomorrow, but these are positive changes for charter schools. They are going to apply attendance and chronic absenteeism data to charter school elementary schools that previously it was not counted, and that will have some positive results for schools. They're also making a correction to the way that the graduation rates were applied. There were some data questions in there, and it's laid out in your submittal, but there's going to be some adjustments there. As a result of these changes, there will be a few charter schools that will move from priority status to focus status, and a school that will move from focus status to continuous improvement. So there's headway being made on these, and we're very grateful to the receptiveness of the department to the questions we've been asking and to working with us on this stuff. With that, just to walk through how this is going to work this morning, Doug will kind of go through some of the results with you and address some of the data things that he's been working on. We do have some action items, which are our next steps going forward, and we'll address those as well, but we'll ask you to defer taking action on those so that you can have the opportunity to hear from Lynn Finnegan of the network first in her separate presentation on StriveHI results, and then have you loop back to the action items after that. So with that, I'll turn things over to Doug.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So with the new information, I'll just go through as if this was presented last week to the committee. But as you know, at a prior commission meeting, Deputy Mizoy was here outlining what StriveHI, how StriveHI rolls out, what are the data elements of that. So now that the data has hit, so at the time of the release, 8 of 14 priority schools, representing the bottom 5%, were charter schools. Positively, there was one recognition school, and that was Navajola, and they've been formally recognized by the board, the DOE, and the legislature as of the other day. Also of note were 3 schools singled out for their very, very high on-time graduation rates, and they were Kaina, MBTA, and UH Lab schools. There were also some surprises when we first saw the data. We saw that some changes, from the previous system with NCLB and the AYP system. Many schools improved in their status to between the two programs, between the two systems. So that list follows with the bullet points of those schools that changed and improved their status with StriveHI. Of the schools that were in priority and focus status, they were all there due to some triggers, some automatic triggers that were set within the ESEA Flex application. Of note, as Tom has just introduced to you, is that there were some nuances between the graduation rate and how that was calculated. So of the 3 priority schools, 3 were there because of a graduation rate trigger. Also, another point, moving down just to the bottom of the submittal, as you can see, I'm not going through this entirely, but we're finding that some schools, just to update the information, some schools did not administer the ACT, completed the whole battery as we thought. So the participation of the ACT for last year, if you recall, there was a little bit of confusion as to what the requirements were for a charter school to implement ACT. Some didn't have the capacity to do it, some opted out of doing that. So some revised numbers follow. Kirsten crunched these numbers based on the results. We do have data files on ACT now, and we found that some of the numbers adjusted, but you can see that 90%, 19 of 21 of the public charter schools with 11th graders completed the ACT, but 29%, 6 of 21 participated in Explore. So what happened here was under the StriveHI index, so as it rolled out, they didn't count against the schools. So what would have happened was for that ACT measure, especially if it was a middle school, those points were redistributed in weights among the other measures. I don't know the math behind this, so I'm trying to learn that as soon as possible, how the mathematics and the formula between that redistribution occurred. So, not being a current statistician, I'll try and get up to date on that as soon as possible. So this is a list of schools and how they fared. These are the schools that have arrived in priority and focus status, and the trigger that got them there. Also, following that is, if there were not a trigger, what would they have been based on the numbers? So you can see that due to triggers, some schools ended up in their status. Otherwise, if it were not for the trigger, they would have ended up somewhere else. To get the information out, understandably, this information rolled out and it hit fairly quickly, and we were immediately asked, we're asking these schools to make decisions fairly quickly because there are some decisions that need to be made both on the DOE side and even within the commission office itself, which Tom's going to talk about in a minute. But in order to get the information out, we held 2 webinars. And we invited all schools to participate, and it was actually intended to be one, but our audio was so bad in the first one, we decided to do a rerun. And so we hit a number of schools. I think between the two webinars, we hit probably between 60 and 80 participants. So we did make an effort to get information out there as quick as possible. There are some remaining issues that we are in discussion with the department with moving forward. And, some of these are just very large, high-level decisions that need to be made moving forward. But all of the concerns that are being voiced to the schools are being forwarded, and Lindsay will attest. Every question I get, I blow up her mailbox and send it to her, and she's been extremely responsive in getting the answers. But the issue of the Hawaiian language assessment is still an issue. It is the same issue from last year as to a school's intention to teach in a Hawaiian medium, and there are issues with the translated assessments. Quite frankly, I've been sort of out of the loop in the development of how the development of a translated Hawaiian test is going, and I honestly at this point don't know the next steps, but the assessment for the Hawaiian focus schools is still a remaining issue. Another issue moving forward that has been flagged with the department is, so for many of our K-12 schools, we're finding that of the K-12, of the grades of K-12, and we actually have some K-10s too that would have fallen into the 12th grade readiness measure. So if you recall the StriveHI index, in the readiness measure, high school is represented by their 11th grade ACT, their college graduation, and their college going rate. And what we found was that at least a couple schools had said, well, this data was based on 1 to 3 kids in that grade level. And so this is an issue that we are in current discussion with the department. Graduation, for graduation, this was in response to some of the changes that occurred, but I think I got most of the information out to the schools that were affected. But basically what had happened here is that for graduation rate calculations, the cohort data represented 2 years of data of cohort data. And also what we realized that in that correction of the cohort, the opportunity to correct the cohort might have been missed by a couple of the charter schools. And so their cohort data, what we're working with the schools to do right now is I've given them, I've gotten access to what the cohort data looked like at the time the calculation was done, and I've asked the schools to go back and see who their cohort should have been, and moving forward, just to make sure that cohort is correct for future years as well. Chronic absenteeism was addressed, and then there is also a question as to how a student is counted and not counted into the chronic absenteeism. So we're getting answers on that now, but basically the initial questions that came from schools were questions like, well, this student was deployed, this student's family was deployed, does that count against us? And so it's questions like that we had to track down initially. But moving forward, so if schools ever asked, it's any student that's called a 4140 withdrawal to homeschool is what counts against. But there are other nuances with this too that we're learning along the way. Okay, so in terms of next steps, this is sort of the decision making, which Tom will talk about. But for schools in priority and focus status, we've asked them, we'll start with priority schools, to make a decision in recognition of their autonomy. The priority schools basically have two choices. Option one, as it's presented, allows basically a complete array of services from the DOE, starting with assistance in a comprehensive needs assessment, the CNA, all the way down to the services and implementation of that. Understanding that some schools may want to remain autonomous in this, there's an option two, do it by yourself. And though the CNA still has to be reviewed in compliance with federal law, they have this option. So once this was identified, we did put it out to the schools and say, will you please decide which way you want to go? And then within the option, do you want to do a model proposed by Vicki Bernhardt or Synergy? If you have questions about that, they're just basically two different turnaround models. If you have questions on that, I have Kalima standing by to answer that question for you. But so in doing this, there's a couple things that have to happen, and understandably the schools, in trying to figure out this information and making the decision, we asked them to make the decision 2 weeks ago, but they're still a little bit struggling in trying to make the best decision possible. But also within that, for DOE schools, for those priority schools, they're going to, and Catherine can help me out if need be, but the schools are going to be asked to revise and take a look at their academic and financial plans. And as you know, and as Curtis and Usha can attest, we don't use that. So what we're doing as a substitute, or what we're proposing as a substitute, is for the schools to use the school plan, originally as part of the Title I plan, but easily adaptable to non-Title I schools too. And so just for decision making, this is the process or the next steps that we want to recommend moving forward to those priority and focus schools. The other important decision and consideration we'll need to make moving down is within the plan for services for priority and focus schools. The DOE has allocated as many as 3 positions to provide this service, and there's some decisions making which I'll pass over to Tom for that discussion.
Okay, I should note that the submittal that you received in advance by email has been updated, so that the copy you have here has some new information if you have read the one where we've laid out both the discussion that I'm about to engage in, but then some of the updates, because as I said, this is such a fast-moving target that it has changed just in the time since we sent out the email. I should also just clarify in one thing that Doug said. It is true that every charter school fell under one of the automatic triggers to be in focus and priority status. It is not necessarily the case that were it not for that trigger, the school would not be in focus or priority status. And it's complicated among other things, but there's other ways to be. There could be more than one trigger applying, or it could be that the index would have gotten them there anyway. But it's also, remember, all relative. So there's always going to be the bottom 5% of schools in the bottom. So schools can move around, and it's not wholly dependent on. You can't just look at the index and say, well, that's where they would be. Otherwise, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And I think we'll be able to see that going forward. Let me talk about the other action item in addition to the. So you'll see when we get to the motions that we've asked for your sanction of what Doug laid out in terms of using our substitute for the ACFIN and some of the next steps. The other aspect of it is one that the request is basically that you authorize me to make the decision, because we're not ready with the recommendation today. There's still moving pieces that we don't have all the facts in on, but we will have to make that call before you convene again in October. And that has to do with the staffing for providing the supports for the priority and focus schools. There are some positions available for that, and the discussion that we've been engaging with the department on is whether it makes the most sense to have those be commission staff or to be DOE staff, and if so, where in the DOE. And there's many different factors. Some of the practicalities have to do with geographic distribution. It has to do with how many of the charter schools decide that they want to opt out of the DOE services and go their own path, so that will affect where it makes sense to deploy the staff. Broadly speaking, though, the biggest issue to sort of sort through on this, and there's pros and cons in either direction, if they are DOE employees, we just have to make sure that they understand charter schools and get charter schools and know the differences, and importantly will be accepted by the charter schools because they're only as effective as their acceptance by the schools. And we have offered, if that's the direction that things go, we'll work with the department to make sure that happens. Conversely, if they're employed by the commission, there's, the success or lack of success of the turnaround of these schools, particularly the priority schools, is basically one step removed from potentially very high stakes decisions that the commission has to make. And you'll recall that Act 130 gives us this warning shot about getting too close to technical assistance and compromising our role as the authorizer. How can you shut us down when we've been doing what, it's the services you've been giving us that determine whether we succeed or fail. And I think we've been discussing with the department, with authorizers on the mainland, with NACSA, with other folks about both the pros and cons. I think either of these complications is one that we can mitigate and will mitigate if that's how it turns out. But until we have a better read on the distribution of schools, and there's other really practical things about, depending on the distribution of schools, are there going to be some DOE people who would have 2 DOE schools and 1 charter to service anyway once you're down that path? There's a lot of things still in motion, but that's essentially the things that we'll have to work through and continue talking about with the department. And so, because we have to make that decision after today, but before your next meeting in October, I'm asking that, having sort of laid out the considerations that I'm going to have to work through to ask for your sanction to sort of make the call when it comes to it. I don't know if you want to take questions on that stuff now, or maybe that it would make more sense to hear Lynn Finnegan give the network's perspective on StriveHI, and then we can come back and do that.
Let's take some questions now.
Just one question. You said that you will possibly make available some staff support.
Yes.
I heard 3 possibly. For a school that selects the DOE support or opt-in for the DOE, is it going to cost the charter? Is there any cost to a charter for opt-in?
The opt-in is paid for in the same way that we paid for any other DOE school. The opt-out it's on the charter school's own dime. But the cost of the training, the cost of the travel, the cost of everything.
Opt-in pays for it?
DOE.
It comes from the DOE, not from the commission's budget either.
Oh, and I should say that also of the staffing, wherever these positions land, they are funded. So it's not as if the commission has to.
It's funded through the DOE,
That's right.
not us, not our commission's budget.
Can we ask Steve or Lisa? Lindsay, sorry. What is the process within the DOE schools that are in priority? Do they have this choice of the Victoria, Bernhardt, or
School synergy.
The school synergy?
Yes.
Okay, so that's no different.
They don't have the opt-out option.
They still have the opt-out option. Yeah. And what is the expected cost of either of those? I mean, I kind of went through what a Victoria Bernhardt's program is, and it looks pretty extensive.
Cool.
And it's very flowchart driven. And I'm
So-
just curious, just trying to gauge if one of our schools opts out, what would be their expected cost of putting a program together?
Apparently she knows the answer better than I do, so.
I just know that part about, Vicki Bernhardt charges $5,000 a day for Brad Geisey, who works with her, is $3,000 a day. That really includes not, the day charges is for their workshops and their institutes, but they do provide support over the whole year.
What would be the expected school cost then? How many
Well,
days of service do they need to?
Well, first of all, it would be the school would first need to even decide if they wanted to bring in a provider. They may not even want to bring someone in necessarily.
Well, I think for a school to decide opt in or opt out, you're going to have to know at least what is the cost of DOE for one program or the other, and kind of say, well, reasonably, that will cost me that much, right? At least, because there's probably some gains or scale cost savings by going through the DOE.
And the school synergy and Vicki Bernhardt models are for the school improvement, the school turnaround. So that's to give the school tools and processes to do its comprehensive needs assessment, develop a plan, and then to monitor and evaluate that plan. But there's a whole other range of services which the school would have access to, so that could be very specific, like for Common Core implementation or RTI.
But your specific question is, if they go it alone, how much is it going to cost them?
Right.
Right.
What would you expect? What would they?
So I don't even want to venture to guess at that right now, because it probably just depends a lot on the size of the school as well.
Right.
And based on their needs. So depending on what the comprehensive needs assessment determines, the level of involvement of the provider may vary as well. But then the other assumption, and this is an assumption, is I would imagine that there may be some who, if they're opting to go it alone, they're really opting to actually go it alone, not contract a third option.
Yeah. I guess the one way what is the budget for priority schools turnaround? How much money does the DOE kind of earmark for that?
I'm not sure off the top of my head. It's something that I could get to the commission.
I just think it's got to be an outrageously expensive, because it's going to have to be, my understanding is it would have to be, if the school did it on their own, it'd have to be sanctioned by the DOE, right?
No.
No, I mean, so you don't have to check the...
No, if the school goes at it on their own, there would be some level of monitoring, but the decision about the content of the turnaround would not be ours. The decision, in other words, we've already made the decision that there are two models that we approve of for our own regular non-charter schools, and so those we're making available to charters.
Got it.
But if you go with the third option, then that's a decision that an individual school would make, and then the accountability is
Would be with the commission.
would be with the commission, and the monitoring would be from the department to some extent, but the accountability really comes from the commission. Ms. Pincus, did I miss anything else?
Just to add on to that, so the one piece that DOE does have to do is review the improvement plan, and they were discussing which piece of paper, which document you use to look to articulate that plan. So our folks would look to make sure it's compliance with the federal requirements and matches the needs identified by the CNA. So it's not a quality check or a judgment on the choices, just that it meets the minimum bar set by the feds, that it meets the needs identified in the CNA. And again, just to re-emphasize what Steve said, that could be a completely internal effort that happens that doesn't include a provider. So it's really difficult to estimate, based on a set of needs identified in the CNA, how the school would choose to address those problems, cost or no cost.
I'd like to ask a question. If you the DOE provides staff to come into your school, but you're going to have to provide appointment presumably or some sort, right? That's how this one will work?
Yeah, I mean, to put it from a different lens, it's a commitment to do it a certain way.
Okay.
You know what I mean? So if you're choosing one of the two options that we are providing, then you're really committing to that being the way that you're attempting to turn around your school. So I guess, yeah, it is intrusive, might not be the word that I would choose, but it's involved. I mean, and I know a little bit more about school synergy than Victoria Bernhardt because of the work in our zone on the Big Island, and it's a comprehensive change in the way that you do business. So schools, when they're making this decision, should really examine the extent to which they're ready to make the commitment to the model. Because what it's not, I don't think, is a few times a year having a consultant come in and do a few trainings, checking a few boxes. You're in, and that's why we have the in option with two of them, and then the out is, and I'm not saying it's impossible to turn around a school without external consultants. Sometimes folks do, but schools have to examine their own situation and see what's best for them.
I had a question. I just want to make sure I heard clearly. I may have misheard. I understand if they're in, it's one of these two options.
Yes.
You said if they're out, they would not be allowed to hire a different provider, or they could at their own expense?
The latter. They could, but it would be financially, it wouldn't be supported by the department.
I have a question about the CAOs and the choice between having the commission employ or supervise them and having them work with DOE. And I'm wondering if the choice is to have the DOE employ the CAOs, would they be working with DOE schools and charters, or would a CAO be assigned just to charters?
So I think Tom stated it well in saying that we're not sure.
Okay.
I think it just depends on, a lot of it is logistical, operational, where the schools are located, what they choose. I think there are situations where we could envision it working with a hybrid, but there are pros and cons of doing it various ways. Of having it be a DOE employee, having it being a commission employee.
So one of the advantages I could see to them being a DOE employee working with both charters and DOE schools is that there could be a cross-pollination of ideas, which is part of the vision for charters, is that there's
Absolutely.
some of that. So I'm just wondering if there's an openness to that concept.
There's certainly an openness to that concept. And on a related note to what you just said about that cross-pollination, I think the relationship that we've been developing over the past few months with the commission, with Tom, with Lynn, has been very positive. So just saying that as an aside, we've been having good communication.
Just to add to that, the group of CAOs, regardless of where they housed, will be treated as a professional learning community. So I think our intention and the person who will be leading that effort intends for that to be the case regardless of where they're housed. I actually think the logistics of the workload of the schools and their geographic dispersity is actually the biggest factor in determining how to deploy these schools. Mm-hmm. And also one clarification that was a little not perfectly described earlier. These folks will have the full set of charter schools will have a liaison within that CAO, regardless of whether they choose the opt-in or opt-out. It's just a different level of support. So even if you're an opt-out charter school, you will still be assigned a CAO who would be available for a much lighter touch level of technical assistance and consultation, much lighter. But everyone will have one.
Just to make sure they're on track.
To answer questions and provide advice.
I just wanted to ask, my general sense is that this effort, intrusive, invasive, inconvenient, whatever word you want to put on it, is going to feel like the accreditation process, because it's an intensive, look in the mirror all day long at yourself. So I think that dynamic is something that is useful, but it's still going to be difficult for people that don't believe that they need to be fixed, or that, that they've been somehow wronged in some way. So it's not gonna be comfortable. And I don't know if that kind of gets to.
No, I assume.
Yeah.
It may not be used in the fashion.
What is the consequence to the school if you opt out and you cannot come up with a acceptable plan? What happens? I know we have a contract.
At some point, you lose your charter.
No, but they can at the end of this year, right? Because,
Right.
but at what point do we judge that is there a deadline to this? This is a deadline, probably, presumably, right? You gotta have a plan by X date. March 1st. So what is the consequence to the school for opting out and not complying?
Well, if they opt out, they're on their own.
Yeah.
That's my general sense. And if they don't deliver, they eventually lose their charter. That's my sense of how it comes
Do we
together.
start that process?
Let's say hypothetically, a school opted out, charted their own path. What they came up with, either the commission's determination was what they came up with sort of wasn't in conformity with the performance contract, and/or the department that's reviewing it for compliance with federal requirements says this doesn't
make it
address
work.
it, or, your comprehensive needs assessment said these were the 5 things, and you're ignoring 4 of the 5, so go back and it says we're not doing it. Then there's a decision, I think, for the commission about whether this is, so generally for this sort of trial year for the contract, revocation is off the table, but we have the intervention protocol in place for non-compliance with things, kind of a scale of things, some more serious than others, just to sort of, so we now have tools in between exhortation and revocation to try to get some progress on something. And I think if the school is not in compliance with the federal programs on this, then the commission has a decision about what those next steps are. We have options.
The intervention protocol would still apply because it's a due date for a plan.
Yes.
It's not a performance
For
issue.
performance
It's
issue.
an intervention protocol for failure on the term of the contract, essentially.
But the contract didn't cover StriveHI plan.
Meeting commission deadlines and
Yeah, and then there's references in the contract to compliance with federal law. There's plenty of levers in the contract. So
Okay.
we are public schools, so.
I just assume that the comprehensive needs assessment, whether you opt in or opt out, the needs assessment is common regardless of the option. No?
No, so there's a protocol that will be written up. I think actually it was due this week or last, so we may be behind on that. So for folks that go their own, they have to sort of make sure they do certain things. What is common is what we're calling the report of findings, which is the sort of based on your needs assessment, here's what your findings are. That is a common template that all the schools will be using. Did you want to add?
Opting out means you would also have to hold the character and needs assessment at the starting point.
I just want to say all of the Title I schools are doing this already, right? To varying degrees of quality.
Any other questions?